Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Levitt, and I'm the President and CEO of the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We are gathered here today on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. It's covered by Treaty 13, the Toronto Purchase. Please take a moment to consider the importance of the Indigenous lands and waters that feed our bodies and souls. Let us also collectively work together to advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights and promote reconciliation. On behalf of FSWC, I'm honored to welcome you to this important day of education and collaboration as we gather to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. When Auschwitz was liberated 78 years ago, on January 27, 1945, the day was forever marked as an occasion to both celebrate and mourn, to reflect on the incredible resilience of the human spirit and courage of survivors, as well as the brutality of which humanity is capable. More than anything, this date represents an opportunity to learn and listen to the survivors and scholars who work to keep this history alive. I want to begin by thanking you for responding to that opportunity by attending our conference today. As we all know, the last few years have brought complexities and challenges to many aspects of our lives. Educators have been on the front lines of this upheaval, trying to guide students through a time marked by chaos, confusion, and rising intolerance of all forms, including an alarming surge in anti-Semitism. One of the most disturbing forms of anti-Semitism is undoubtedly the Holocaust distortion and denial. As we move further away from the Second World War, we see the very idea of historical truth increasingly under threat, particularly online. At FSWC, as an education-focused human rights organization, it's made easier knowing we don't stand alone in the face of these challenges. We stand with you and support you in your efforts to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and to teach new generations lessons of universal importance that we can draw from this horrifically dark chapter of human history. We work with school boards across the country to educate thousands of students on topics related to the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, the crime of genocide, racism, and other forms of intolerance in Canada, media literacy, online hate, and other key themes designed to respond to the needs of our time. We will continue to build partnerships with allies in our community and all communities so that we can create a strong defense to fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Educators are the key to the alliance we must build to counter this rising threat of ignorance and intolerance. Misinformation and outright denial of the Holocaust must not be allowed to spread unchecked and unchallenged. As Simon Wiesenthal once said, the information is key to building a defense against repeating the crimes of history. Let's all embrace the learning opportunity presented here today and in turn, share these lessons with our students and people of all ages. We hope you find today's program to be engaging and informative. I know I'm eager to listen and learn alongside you all. Thank you again for all your support and dedication to Holocaust remembrance. It's now my pleasure to introduce our conference chair, Angela Terpstra, head of school at Bishop Strachan, I'm going to give a little bit of her bio first as well before she comes up here. An experienced educator and administrator, widely respected for her extensive contributions to pedagogy design. Dr. Terpstra has been at BSS since 2005 and was appointed to her current position in 2018. Dr. Terpstra received her BA from McMaster University in 1980, her Bachelor of Ed from Queen's University in 1981, her MA in 1988 from McMaster University, and, last but not least, her principal's certificate from Harvard University in 2007. In November 2007, she received her PhD from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Dr. Terpstra places immense priority on cultivating compassionate and ethical citizens who exhibit kindness and generosity and value differences in religion, race, opinions, and ideas. She's inspired by the idea of private schools with public purpose and uses the resources available in an independent school setting to lead the way in forward-thinking education for girls that teachers the world over can learn from. All of that leads me to say to you, I also can tell you that Angela is just a wonderful individual who is so committed to teaching and learning and understanding about Holocaust and Holocaust education. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Terpstra to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. So now you all know how old I am. If you do the math that way. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Michael. Just move it up a little bit. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is a wonderful experience to be in this room again with educators, with other policymakers, with the police, with all of us who are concerned with the things that Michael talked about. This is an opportunity for us to come together and learn from each other, and I'm here to learn as well. Always, all those degrees, it's all about learning. It's just about how do we actually make ourselves better. One thing I was mentioning to Andy this morning was that I'm always interested in what makes more of me, and I think that's a really important thing to communicate to our students, to our clients, to those who are around us as well. So good afternoon and welcome to this vitally important conference. It is actually really wonderful to be in person, although the snowstorm may have actually kept a few people away, sadly. But this is really important for the time we live in right now. It's important for the work we do, for the people we work with, and especially because, as Michael mentioned, tomorrow marks the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. January 27th, 1945, a freezing cold January day. The horror of Auschwitz-Birkenau had gotten worse since mid-January, as even larger numbers of prisoners had been killed or forced into a death march. Yet 7,000 prisoners remained there. They had been starved for years, tortured, isolated. We cannot begin to imagine what it was to be there on that day, in a place where 1.3 million people had been taken in the previous years, and over 1.1 million had died. So tomorrow marks the day when the Soviet army opened the gates, and they saw worse things than they could ever imagine. We know the horror of the larger story of this. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered. Millions of other groups killed, millions displaced, and truly traumatized for the rest of their lives. The terror of a campaign that began with words. For those of us in education, and those of you in the public sphere as well, whose daily work is with people, words are our business. They are how we communicate. They are how we build relationships. They are how we tell our stories. We use language to express our feelings, to do all these things. And we also know how important it is that words lead to action. They can't just simply remain as words. So for us here, our actions are about building up, educating for positive outcomes, helping kids and others who we come in contact with learn to be good people, to pick themselves up from mistakes, to be moral forces for good, and to take responsibility in whatever sphere they find themselves. Sadly, our world is fraught with words and actions now that divide, that build walls, fuel suspicion, and yes, lay seeds for hate. Within my world, during COVID, kids in Hillel classes had their classes Zoom bombed. Houses in neighborhoods across Toronto, not far away from here, had their Hanukkah decorations set on fire or their lights destroyed. Not long before that, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Philadelphia invaded, 11 worshipers were murdered. Words and actions continue to hurt. And so now, more than ever, we need to take a stand. In November 2022, our Ministry of Education released news of an updated curriculum in grade 6 classes across the province to address anti-Semitism and the Holocaust education. In the news release, the shocking facts hit all of us again and again, and I quote from the news release. Anti-Semitic events are on the rise in schools across Ontario, with over 50 incidents involving anti-Semitic hate symbols occurring in the Toronto District School Board alone in the 2021-22 school year. According to a 22 study of anti-Semitism and Holocaust knowledge conducted by Western University and Liberation 75, 42% of students surveyed said that they had unequivocally witnessed an anti-Semitic event. This study also found that 1 in 3 students think the Holocaust was fabricated or exaggerated, or that they are unsure if it actually happened. 1 in 3 students. That is still shocking to me as I read it again now. And it came from somewhere. It came from somewhere. Students didn't just make that up. So if we extrapolate, are 1/3 of the people in this province are unaware of the Holocaust? That is shocking as well. We have work to do. And if words matter and actions matter, people matter. Walter Benjamin, the great German Jewish philosopher who committed suicide in 1940 after being captured, wrote about the Nazi evil. He said, "Even the dead won't be safe. This is not only a terror against people, but a general cultural fall." Those of us in schools, policing, institutions of care and growth, we must do all we can to prevent that general cultural fall. As anti-Semitism rises, we have to rise too. Hate in all its forms is abhorrent to a culture of humanity. For hundreds of years, Europeans have expelled Jews. They've built ghettos to enclose them, created laws to exclude Jews from social and cultural institutions. The Nazis stood in a long line of anti-Semitic horrors, and to our shame and sorrow, that line is continuing today. So today in our time, words are ominously threatening again. I also think of the words of Eleanor Roosevelt when she said, "When will our consciences grow so tender that we will act to prevent human misery rather than to avenge it?" When will that be, I ask myself. For those of us doing this work, it is now. Our consciences must be tender enough to do the work to counter anti-Semitic actions and to be constantly reminding ourselves of our responsibility while relearning the horrors of the Shoah. Those 1/3 of kids in Ontario need to hear us, and so do their families. Let this not be a general cultural fall. Together, let us catch ourselves and work together. But in all of this, there is hope. There is actually hope in the same statistics that came out about 1/3 not knowing anything about the Holocaust. The same study that I mentioned above also said 92.6 Ontario students said they wanted to learn more about the Holocaust. 87.1 students reported interest in learning more about genocides. To me, that is incredibly hopeful. Those are powerful stats. Somehow they must have gotten lost in the news releases, but our work needs to focus on those students, that huge majority who want to learn more. That is part of our hope. Hope also comes from another place. Every single Holocaust survivor who I have heard speak always speaks of hope. I can't understand where that comes from, hearing them speak about the experiences they've gone through. Last summer, Andy, who is here, accompanied our wonderful band of learners. We went to Poland and Israel on a Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center Compassion to Action trip. Andy, survivor of the Budapest ghetto, calls every survivor's story a love story. Love of family, love of life, and love of freedom. On the same trip, we also heard the astonishing testimony of Lydia Maksimowicz, deported as a child to Auschwitz-Birkenau at 3 years old. She lived in the children's block of the camp where she underwent several horrible medical experiments. And I can't even begin to imagine the hunger, the lice, the feelings of terror among all the children at the arrival of the doctors. The roll call in which they were called with numbers tattooed on their arm. And yet Lydia, like Andy, speaks of hope. She met the Pope in 2019, and he kissed her tattoo, and she responded to him saying, "Hate only brings more hate. Love, on the other hand, has the power to redeem." Before I went to Poland and Israel, I had an academic understanding of the Holocaust. Mine was a typical early education reading Anne Frank's diary, learning about the Holocaust in school. As a teenager, this was amplified by reading Leon Uris's Exodus. And then I took a university German history course called The Habsburgs to Hitler, which was more intellectual history than Habsburgs or Hitler. However, the backdrop was there, and yet none of my readings, courses, movies had prepared me to be there in Auschwitz and to notice shockingly that red shoes stand out in the heaps of gray shoes that are left as traces there. To be at Yad Vashem and see the personal names and stories of so many lost to hate. To be on the bus with Andy Reddy and hear him share his pain and love of the journey to safety beyond the ghetto with his mother. We need to be witnesses for Andy, for Lydia, and all those who lived and lost their lives in the Holocaust. Your presence here today and your willingness to engage in the work is for the Andys and the Lydias. It's for all those millions who are the individual, the singular, the named Jews tortured or killed. They are the Shoah. Our words, our actions, and today are part of their work, the work of hope. And that hope begins now. I am honored now to introduce Dr. Edward Westermann. I have to find the right page now. Dr. Westermann, I'm so sorry. Dr. Westermann received his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M University-San Antonio. He has published extensively in the areas of German military history and the Holocaust. He is the author of Hitler's Police Battalions, Enforcing Racial War in the East, and Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, Comparing Genocide and Conquest. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Berlin, a 3-time German Academic Exchange Service Fellow, and a J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His most recent work, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, appeared with Cornell University Press in association with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in March 2021. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edward Westermann.
Okay, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to first thank the friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center here for asking me to speak. Michael, I'd like to thank you for this invitation. Dr. Terpstra, thank you for your remarks. And also Melissa McKell, I want to thank, who's really put this together. And I know she has a kind of an army of helpers. I saw them all here this morning. So for all those who worked to put this together as well. And hopefully today, in talking about this book, I think it's not just a book that we look at and say it's history. I think we're going to see some convergences of themes and ideas that we can apply to our own and our current situation. So if we get our technology, now don't worry, it's coming. There it comes. Okay. Could we maybe dim the lights just a little bit? It'll probably help the people in the back. So, as was discussed, this is a book when I started it to look at what role did alcohol play in the Holocaust. And what we see here is a picture. This is actually a police battalion. These are members of Police Battalion 101. And many in this room will be familiar with Chris Browning's work, Ordinary Men. This is the cohort before the cohort of policemen that he looked at. And what you're seeing here is something that's not really very extraordinary at all. It's a Christmas celebration. The unit was stationed outside of the Łódź ghetto, and it's Christmas of 1940. And like many units in the East, military units around the world, they're celebrating this holiday and they're drinking. However, what I would point out is this is another picture from that same Christmas celebration. And what you see in this Christmas celebration is that they've decided to include a skit. So they've taken one of the policemen, they've dressed him as a Jew who's carrying a basket, so he's been caught smuggling in this case. And what you see with that is three of his comrades are lined up around him, and they're smiling and laughing and joking like they've caught him out. Well, what you would need to know is in the previous month that Police Battalion 101 has been outside of the Łódź ghetto, they've made a dramatic use and routine use of their weapons in interdicting Jewish smugglers in and out of the ghetto. So what was the skit that they decided to include in their Christmas celebration? A skit that celebrates what they've been involved in, which is daily murder of these individuals. And that's something they found to be amusing. So as I started out on this journey looking at alcohol and its role, really the first question that I just had was, what role did alcohol and drinking rituals play amongst the perpetrators in the East especially? And then it became apparent to me that it was not just a question of literal intoxication, so drinking, but there was a metaphorical intoxication. The control of the land and the bodies of others. And in places like concentration camps, in ghettos, in the killing fields, we see that control over the bodies and fates of others. And then as I continue to kind of think about this subject, one of the things that struck me was the idea of masculinity and how masculinity formed the basis for the way that these men, these perpetrators, saw themselves as tough, as hard men, and how some of this masculinity also influenced the way that they became involved in the actions that they were involved in. And the most striking thing that came out of this discussion, I'm going to move my cup, was that celebratory ritual and festive rituals that were incorporated into acts of mass murder really struck me. And so as I was looking at the topic and thinking about how alcohol is used, here's a list of the things that I came up with. And some of this is not very surprising. Social bonding and celebration. I know we have educators here. I lasted for like a year and a half in an American high school before I sucked the soul out of me and I wasn't able to teach anymore. I had to do a period of in-school suspension every day, and I think that's what drove me over the edge. But why do I bring that up? Because Fridays, teachers after work like to get together, or at the break, right? It's a time to socially bond, to celebrate. And we've all anniversaries, weddings, birthdays, for example. But there's also rituals of drinking and different groups. I was a pilot in the Air Force, and we had different types of drinking rituals at the bar involving certain types of games, also in competitions that were there. So thinking about how alcohol itself was involved in that. And anybody that knows anything about college life, and my students get this when I talk about alcohol, masculinity, and sexual violence, the incorporation of the way in which alcohol, fraternity culture, rugby teams, football teams, we have enough news media reports on that to understand how alcohol can be incorporated in these types of actions. And selective disinhibition, this is what I tell my students, is the spring break effect. And what I mean by that, I tell them, is that when they decided to go to Daytona for spring break, and they checked into that hotel that had the balcony on the 3rd floor that overlooked the pool, when they checked in, they weren't thinking about, hey, it would be a great idea to try to jump from the balcony into the pool. But after a day of drinking, when one of their buddies says, hey, I bet I could make it, that all of a sudden it seems like something that's worth trying. So the way in which alcohol disinhibits also behavior is something I want to talk about. The other thing is facilitation, how alcohol itself can facilitate acts of violence. And this is going to be something I'm going to really emphasize as we look at this. Alcohol is used as an incentive and reward in the East, certainly amongst the perpetrators. But the thing that I've left here at the bottom is coping. And again, those who've read Chris Browning's work on Ordinary Men, if you hear alcohol talked about in a number of Holocaust histories, it normally gets maybe a sentence or two, maybe a paragraph. And what it's talking about, the only way that men could do what they did was they had to drink, that allowed them to do it, or after they'd been involved in this, they would go back to the barracks, they'd go back to the bar, and the only way they could deal with what they did that day was to drink themselves kind of into a stupor. That's become essentially the bumper sticker discussion of how alcohol was used in the Holocaust. And I'd like to complicate that by the end of our discussion today. So this is the way I laid out the book. And what I'd point out here is that as you see some of these topics, it's not necessarily about literal intoxication. It's also about the intoxication of the control over others. So when we talk about uses of rituals of humiliation against Jewish men and Jewish women in the Holocaust, the cutting of beards, the setting of beards on fire, the cutting of sidelocks, making people crawl around on the ground, clean streets with their underwear or with toothbrushes, that is metaphorical intoxication, the control over others. And we see that these two can work together. What I'd also like to point out is some of you may be familiar with Omer Bartov's book on Buchach, the community, and he talks in that book about the removal as the Jews as a part of a day's work as entertainment. And he uses that word entertainment. And it's an important thing to think about, because if we look at the way the words are used by those who witnessed what was happening, the so-called Horbansprach, the language of destruction, was an idea that Yiddish, as communities are being destroyed, individuals who live in those communities are trying to create a vocabulary to describe what they're witnessing. And the vocabulary that comes out of that are things like, it was like a wedding metaphor. And I want you to think in terms of when we take the witnesses at their word, what would probably be the single most joyous day in the shtetl's life? It would be something like a wedding. Why? Celebration, food, music, alcohol, right? So the victims are watching the Germans destroy their communities, and they are looking for a vocabulary. And the vocabulary they're looking at, it was like a wedding atmosphere. So I can't climb into the minds of the perpetrators, but I can take the victims and the witnesses at their word to understand the words that they're trying to use to describe what they're seeing. And it's incumbent upon any historian, when I talk about what do I mean by this theoretical construct of masculinity. Well, we all kind of understand that there's perceptions of what masculinity is. I played Texas high school football. I guarantee you, we all knew what that code meant, what it was to be a man playing football. In theoretical terms, we talk about hegemonic masculinity, kind of the dominant idea of what masculine values are. And that changes in different societies and different times. That's not the same definition today as it was, let's say, 50 years ago. But in looking at Nazi society, what I talk about is hypermasculinity. I talk about a militarized society in which the greatest thing a German boy could do for his Führer and for his fatherland was to die for Germany. And the greatest thing a young German girl could do was to have children to support that effort. And I'm going to talk about performative masculinity, the idea that men performing against men, and I'll give you some examples of that. And here in this case, this is in the book, this is what I describe, how in a racial society, perceptions of sexuality, racism, and genocidal warfare all come together, and how that then influences the way that men in police battalions and SS murder squads and other groups, how they perform. And what's important to note is that this doesn't just happen in 1933, January of 1933, when Hitler takes power. That these ideas exist already well before Hitler comes to power, and they exist in the so-called stormtroopers. So what you have is you have these SA-Heime, stormtrooper homes, or stormtrooper Kneipen bars, and these men get together, and it is a male-dominated space. Women aren't allowed into that space. If there's a special occasion where women are allowed in, they're allowed to drink soft drinks or water. They're not allowed to drink alcohol. Okay, so it's very much defined by these specific gender roles. Camaraderie is important. Performative masculinity, being able to be tough enough for your buddies. So this all by itself is not a big deal. This could be working class bars in New York in the 1940s, where Pete Hamill says there was two things in a working class bar that made you stand out: your ability to hold your liquor and your ability to use your fists, right? But what happens? Well, one of the things I didn't expect to see here was the importance of song. Well, why is that song important? Because the nature of the song, the types of song that are used, anti-Semitic songs that are integrated into these celebrations, for example, are part of that. And what does it lead to? And it was Dr. Terpstra was talking about rhetoric to a certain degree, right? Well, rhetoric that's normalized that becomes political violence is what we see. So what we see in this period, how these bars become sites for political mobilization and then lead to political violence. And here I have a discussion. I'm sure that many people in this room, and when I talk to my students, have been to a concert some point in their life. And I went to a One Direction concert with my daughter. And now I understand. I was too young for Elvis, but now I get it, okay? Because the janitor would walk by before we got in there as we stood packed outside the auditorium, and a scream would go up because somebody walked by the front of the door. But that kind of power sometimes about how music, right, can make us feel. We underestimate how that can be used also in a way as a negative force, and how it can be used to bind people in a negative purpose. And there's discussions, white power music, for example. Nancy Love has a great book called Trendy Fascism, where she looks at how these groups also incorporate music, rhetoric, and violence with drinking and perceptions of masculinity. So we see that in Nazi Germany. We also see that the first areas, the zones of exception for this control, it doesn't happen after the war starts. It happens before the war starts. So with the creation of the concentration camps, where we see SS guards involved in rituals of humiliation against Jewish, communist, socialist, asocial, in quotation mark, gay men, for example, are groups that are persecuted in these camps. We see the use of violence in amusement. And I use that term amusement because that's what witnesses the term. They were laughing, they were enjoying themselves. The way in which those who were persecuted saw their persecutors, I think is important to talk about. Competitions between male guards. So I can't tell you the number of SS guards that have the nickname the Boxer. Well, where do they get the nickname the Boxer? They get it because they pride themselves on their ability to knock out prisoners with a single blow. And they practice that routinely in the camps. And we even see how competitions between guards take place, and I can talk about some of that in questions. Murder games, the incorporation of lethal violence for enjoyment here. And here at the bottom we have one witness talking about how the guards made them crawl around and bark and meow, laughing sadistically. So this idea of enjoyment and laughter, the way that the witnesses remember it. We also have, in this case, Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant at Auschwitz, who himself on his death row memoir writes how his guards looked upon the flogging of prisoners as a, quote, welcome spectacle, a kind of entertainment. Again, the words that are used here are important. How music is incorporated into these activities. So what you see here on the left is Sobibor. That's one of the killing centers in eastern Poland. It is purpose-built for trains to arrive and people to be processed and murdered. Now, what you also see here is there's an SS canteen. It's like a pub restaurant for the SS. And that's the patio they're sitting out on. And here we have these German SS men. One's playing the violin, one's playing the accordion. This is where that they would sit and celebrate. But you also have to think about these men in these positions. This is roughly 300 meters away from mass murder. And if you read the accounts of what Treblinka, what Sobibor, what Belzec are like, one of the first things that people who lived in those areas talk about is often the smell and how overpowering it was. These guys are sitting out, enjoying themselves within hundreds of meters of where mass murder is taking place. I think that also gives an idea of the way that murder is normalized. This, to me, is an extremely important slide. And it's important because what we learn, how the survivor in this ghetto talks about what happened, how these SS men, these Gestapo men came in to the ghetto. And she talks about they killed lots of people as a sport. But equally important is when it occurred. It happened on New Year's Eve, 1942. So what were those SS men doing? Like many of us on New Year's Eve, they were drinking and they were going to celebrate a new year coming in. And what did they decide that they wanted to do as the first thing to start the new year? What they decided they wanted to do was to go in the ghetto and to kill Jews. Now again, I cannot get into the minds of those individual perpetrators, but that behavior and that action gives me an insight into how those groups felt about what they were doing. And this is the facilitation process. This is where the drinking led to, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to start our new year by going in the ghetto and killing? How they ended the year, they're going to start the new year. This is a police bar from the Warsaw Ghetto, the Krokmalna Bar, which is named for a street that ran through the ghetto. And these are members of Police Battalion 61. And what would really probably surprise you, if you can see it very clearly, is the left-hand photograph is the actual bar area. And above that bar, what have they hung up? They've taken a Star of David as a light fixture in a very cynical way to put that in their bar. And if we were to turn around from that bar and look around on the walls, what we would notice is all these self-painted murals. So the policemen had decided to decorate their bar. And the way they decorated their bar with murals of policemen involved with caricatured pictures of Jews. And one of them shows a Jewish man reaching down to pick up a potato, and with a policeman and his rifle leveled at his back, getting ready to shoot him. So this is the atmosphere at the end of the day that they're going to sit in the bar and drink and boast about what they did that day. But the thing that would have struck you, if we could be back at that bar, as we went into that bar, the first thing we would have noticed was there was a wooden door going into that bar. And notches in groups of 5 had been carved into that door. And eventually there's going to be 500 notches. So what did those men do before they went into that bar? The people that they'd shot that day, they tallied their score. They kept their score. I talked about performative masculinity and competition. That's one manifestation of that. So we see that here again. It's not just also that music, again, something that we continue to think about as an entertainment, as a positive good, is also incorporated into acts of killing. And in this case, we have at Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp in Germany, north of Berlin, where they're describing how SS murder orgies that grew into real parties, and the German term is Feste. And again, it's important for us to understand the language that people are using is the language that they know that describes the activity. Schnapps poured in rivers and loudspeakers played music over the screams of the victims. In another case for a police battalion, you have accordions being played, music being played at the actual execution sites. Now again, I can't get into the minds of the perpetrator, but these behaviors, this staging, if you will, of mass murder and the use of music as part of that gives me insights into the way that these men were thinking about what they were involved in. Here we also see, and this is one of the most grotesque things that in looking at this, that becomes kind of hard to imagine. And Patrick Dubois' Holocaust by Bullets really brings this aspect out. The idea that policemen at the killing site would have a grave, and if it was a large community, it might take 1 or 2 days to kill an entire community. So what you had tables of food and alcohol, in some cases music, that would be set up. Now I want you to think about what that would mean. 10, maybe 20 men going to a shooting site, in this case taking 20 of their victims with them, or 10 of their victims, shooting several groups, these policemen then rotating out of the killing and going and sitting down and eating and drinking. And I have a Polish survivor who remembered, he was a Polish Gentile. He remembered being at one of these sites, and he came back home, and his sister was there and wanted him to eat lunch. And he told her, "I can't eat." And he said, "If you had seen and smelled what I saw and smelled today, you wouldn't eat for a month." There's a physiological obstacle, burden, to try to eat or drink at these sites. Because as many of the perpetrators remembered, the smell was awful. There's a smell of death. There's a smell of murder. And again, we see the incorporation of these types of activities that really start to give us a different way of thinking about what the perpetrators are seeing and doing. We also see, with respect to masculinity, we see the incorporation of the idea of even bringing women to the sites. And those who know Wendy Lauer's book, Hitler's Furies, we see some of that performance for women. There's a policeman. He's been involved in one of these killings. And the way he ends the day, he comes back from the killing, and because it's up close and personal right behind your victim, you are literally at the end of the day covered with the blood and body matter of your victims. And what this policeman does is he likes a German secretary. And so he doesn't first go to the barracks to take a shower. what he decides to do is to go see her in the office. And I know what his expectation was. His expectation was that she would be impressed by how hard and tough a guy he was. Now, I don't know what her reaction in reality was, but I know what he thought her reaction would be. And again, we see the behavior here discussed. And again, here, this is a policeman describing about this music capella, a band's playing as Jews are being led off to be shot. And the German policeman, when he's investigated after the war, he said it was loud, just like a carnival. And the German word is a Volksfest, literally a carnival. And some historians have said, yeah, the reason that they played music was to drown out the shooting. Well, I've been on military firing ranges, and I guarantee you that music doesn't drown out the shooting of automatic weapons, right? Why is it that we want to believe the music was played to drown out shots? Because we can't imagine that music could be used for another reason, as an accompaniment to murder in this case. So we also see how this idea of performative masculinity is included in the way in which men boasted. They kept score. Some of them carved notches in their lockers. They kept their numbers. And what did they do in the bar? They got into the bar and they compared themselves to other men in that bar with those numbers. And this one was really striking to me. This is a case where a German administrator is going into what's known as das Deutsche Haus, which would be the German, it's only for Germans, it's a pub restaurant. And he hears this singing, he hears this celebration going on inside, and he reaches for the front door as he's about to enter. And as he's going in, there's a Gestapo guy coming out. And the first thing he notices about the guy is that he has a beer coaster, and it's on his uniform tunic. And in red ink, the number 1000 is on that beer coaster. And he asks him, hey, what's going on? Is there a celebration? And the guy turns to him and says, yeah. He goes, today I'm celebrating my 1000th Knickschuss, literally shot in the back of the neck. He's celebrating his 1000th murder. That's the celebration of murder amongst your comrades. And, oh, by the way, it just doesn't happen in the East. It happens in Germany, the so-called T4 or euthanasia program. Many of those individuals, as you know in this room, will be transferred to the killing centers. And what do they celebrate? These men who will later go to the East. One is celebrating his 20,000th burning, the 20,000th victim that has now been processed, if you will. And as the Warsaw Ghetto is being emptied, in the summer and fall of 1942, most of those Jews are being sent to Treblinka. At Treblinka, they're keeping score. And when they get to the number 100,000, they're going to have a special party that evening. That's what they're going to celebrate at Treblinka. So we also see in testimony, this is the case of Sobibor, and anybody who knows about Sobibor is that this is a train station that is in very close proximity to the killing site. And in fact, it's not just trains for deportations that show up there. It's trains that, commercial trains go through there as well. And there's a Polish woman, and what she wants is a cigarette. And she's standing on the platform, and she hears music and she hears laughter behind a door. And what she decides she's going to do is go see if they have cigarettes in there. And she opens this door. And what she talks here about is she's struck by these richly covered tables, these German SS and auxiliary. And she says they were in a clearly drunken state. They amused themselves and told stories about their families. A huge man played the balalaika and wore an unusually valuable ring on his finger. Now, all those bottles of alcohol and all that food that's in that restaurant, where did they come from? They came from those deportation trains. They were taken. And the fact that she noticed that ring on the guy playing the balalaika, where did that ring come from? It came from the possessions of those who had been murdered. And in fact, several years ago, at the arrival ramp at Sobibor, there was an excavation, an Israeli, Dutch, and Polish team. And these are some of the objects that they found. And this is not the ring that gentleman wore. But what I'm showing you is it could be exactly like that ring. These are the artifacts that were also taken by the perpetrators as they killed. And when we see things like at Auschwitz, Johann Kremer was an SS doctor, and he has a diary that's pretty well known, and most of his diary entries are only 2, 3, maybe 4 lines. So here in this diary entry from November 8th, 1942, he's talking about performing his, in this case, 12th and 13th Sonderaktion, which would mean mass gassing, because an SS doctor had to be at the gas chambers when there was a gassing. And then he transitions that diary entry to talking about this cozy evening company with his buddies that included Bulgarian red wine and Croatian plum brandy. The juxtaposition of mass murder with having a cozy evening. And for those, obviously, we talk about the International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the liberation of Auschwitz, but the 20th of January, 1942, the Wannsee Conference. How did the Wannsee Conference, the implementation of the final solution, how did it end? Well, it ended with Reinhard Heydrich and Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, and another guy by the name of Müller, Heinrich Müller, sitting around the fireplace, smoking cigars and cognac. Okay, they're celebrating the end of a successful meeting that was about the destruction of the European Jews. But Eichmann also has testimony from Jerusalem in which he talked about he met Heydrich one last time. And what you have to remember, between January 1942 and May 1942, Heydrich was going to be assassinated. So what happened the next time that Eichmann met Heydrich? He talks about, we sang a song, we drank, we climbed up on a chair and drank again, and then on to the table, a type of merrymaking I had not known. What reason would a lieutenant colonel have to meet the highest ranking SS officer between January of 1942 and May of 1942? It was to update his boss on how the final solution was going. And must have been pretty good news from Heydrich's perspective if they were singing and drinking on top of a table. So again, we see the celebratory nature of this. We also see it in pictures. This is on the Eastern Front. This is a Wehrmacht unit. As you can probably tell, it's Christmas time again. But I look at all the bottles that are there, right? You see the drinking that's taking place. And Ilya Ehrenberg, who is the Red Army journalist and propagandist, he writes about how in our towns, Soviet towns, they are violating women and hanging men. They are guzzling alcohol and sleeping off their orgies like swine. Now, some of us might say, well, you know, that's Russian propaganda during the war, so let's see what a German soldier wrote home about. The way it's whored and guzzled here is incredible. One picture. This picture is, for me, is really also something that really striking. Because it's 2 SS men, it's 1943, it's near Kharkiv, and they're chugging. But what you can't tell that they're chugging is that's French champagne. That's Moet and Chandon. So, what does it mean? It means that the regime is sending literally hundreds of thousands of bottles of wine and champagne and beer into the front. These guys are chugging French champagne in a game, a competition on the Eastern Front in 1943. Just another picture of that. Now I'm going to end up by saying, okay, what's the so what here? What do I want to leave you with? Well, alcohol has been a topic, as I said when I wrote the book. It's been kind of hiding in plain sight. It's everywhere. If you start looking for it, you start to find it. It was important in the creation of shared identity and mission. But what's really important to kind of underline is it was neither necessary nor sufficient. The Holocaust happens with or without alcohol. However, the way it's incorporated by the perpetrators into their acts is where we are able to gain insights into the types of behaviors they used while drinking, while competing. Another thing that I would talk about here is that alcohol can be used in various ways. Certainly, some men use alcohol as coping. But what I've kind of talked to you about here is really complicating that picture of the idea that we feel comfortable with. The only way these men could have done it is if they were drunk. And this is a photo I like to end my presentations with. It comes from an earlier book that I did on the police. I can talk about theories of masculinity and perpetrator motivation, but it's really important to remind ourselves about that individual humanity of what the Holocaust means. And this is a picture from an anti-partisan collection in the German archives. And it's one of those pictures that when I found it for the first book, I just had to stop. Because what we have going on here, as I decode it, is we have a young woman you see in the middle. You see the little boy in the very tattered clothing there. They're out in the woods, and she's being interrogated by a security service interrogator, the SD on his cuff. And behind her are policemen. And what they've been out is so-called Judenjagd. They've been out searching for Jews in the forest. Now, I don't know what the relationship is between that young girl and that little boy. And I don't know what her fate is and his fate is. But what I can tell you from my own research is that in tens of thousands of cases, those people found out in the woods without papers, this would have been the last moment that you would see them, because shortly thereafter, they would have been executed. And this is one of those pictures that reminds me it's not about academic theories, it's about individuals. So this is my 6,000,001 and my 6,000,002. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. I'll put Arjinder and Alan on the spot if I don't get any questions, since they were sitting at my table. They're going like, oh, no, don't do that. Oh, we got one. Okay, you're safe. It's good.
I was just curious. The Third Reich and the top Nazis routinely profess an extremely health-conscious, no-smoking, extremely stringent appearance. And at the same time, they're still facilitating a massive consumption of alcohol. How was it that the Nazis are able to have these two narratives coexisting together? How were they expressing it or excusing it to the general public? What was the general mentality between this health-conscious narrative and this consumption and furiously toxic, deeply dangerous alcohol?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So you're absolutely right. So in the public sphere, the Nazis have what they call the Getränkefrage, the drinking question. And the idea is what they recognize, Leonard Conti, who is the health minister, they recognize that alcohol is damaging to health. And so they're trying to create this sense of temperance. And for example, the good young German girl in the Hitler Youth, she doesn't drink and she doesn't smoke. The young boy is not supposed to be a drinker either. And in fact, what we know is that in Nazi Germany, about 30,000 individuals are going to be forcibly sterilized on the diagnosis of chronic alcoholism by itself. So the regime has this anti-alcohol, if you will, kind of view. But the paradox of that, and I call it the looking glass logic of the Third Reich, is that those who are, quote, most asocial in their use of alcohol, as I've described here, are the so-called elites of that black racial order, right? The SS and the Green Legions of the police in this case. And so we see this kind of one of those paradoxes of paradoxes, that Jewish men could be sexual predators, but effeminate, that Jews could be capitalists and communists, right? The logic that doesn't make sense, and if it did, it's dangerous, because then, I tell my students, if you understand this, then we're in trouble, right? So the point is, right, exactly these paradoxes that we see. Now, another thing that is very, you have to understand from a cultural perspective, is that that beer is not classified as alcohol in Germany, and the term is liquid bread, right? So the idea that it's just a foodstuff or a nutrient, it's not necessary. Now, schnapps, wine would be alcohol, right? But even the way in which the cultural, the incorporation of alcohol within the culture we see. And where I would point out, for example, in Germany, celebrations, the numbers I talked about, the 20,000 burnings, the 100,000th victim at Treblinka, there's a real culture in the German military of celebrating either round numbers, right? So that cultural incorporation of these celebrations is something that you have to understand as well as that. But yeah, it doesn't make sense, but that's, again, one of those paradoxes we see. Yes?
I guess tying into the whole culture around alcohol, because let's say sake in Japan, for example, a lot of it can be used to offer it up to gods and whatnot. Do you think that there was some sort of pioneer, like they would save like a certain champagne bottle? Because from the pictures, it kind of looked like it didn't really matter to them. The champagne, usually you pop it off, but you find on the floor maybe this kind of display.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We see some of this manifestation actually in the Japanese Imperial Army as well. Some of the manifestations of drinking and sexual violence. And in looking at this topic, and this is obviously a very difficult, when we talk about this kind of issue of sexual violence, I don't like to, with my students, you got to be careful, and you also want to be, you want to do it in the right way, right? But let me just, the hard facts of this are, as Peggy Sanday Reeves, who's a sociologist, looking at university culture in the United States, that sexual violence against women by fraternity members was more about the bonding that the men achieved through that sexual violence and about the sexual violence itself. We see that, for example, in the letter of a Japanese soldier who writes back, an enlisted soldier, writing back that he knew he was accepted in the group when they allowed him to participate in a gang rape. Right? And he's not talking about the sexual part of it. He's talking about his acceptance into the group. In the same way that we see on the Eastern Front, 20 years ago, we were not talking about, it would be racial defilement. We didn't have this kind of going on. And in fact, what we know, generation of largely female scholars have looked at this issue. And we know that sexual violence is widespread. In fact, an SS court estimates that at least 50% of SS and policemen have been involved in sexual relations, whether coerced or consensual, with women of inferior blood, right? So we see again how in the East these zones of exception, this camaraderie is also formed not only over the alcohol they're drinking, but in the acts that they participate in with each other, right? And it's this kind of, if you will, this drinking that you're asking about. The idea is that you're not going to lose control of your faculties. Himmler's ideas, these celebration evenings, he calls them fellowship evenings. So after a killing, his idea is the policemen or the SS group will get together and there'll be music. He talks about poetry, there'll be song, and that each man will drink maybe a half liter or a liter of beer total. And they're supposed to decompress, and they're not supposed to talk about what they're involved in. In truth, if I look at what a Polish waitress remembers about these SS fellowship evenings, she recalled how they would come in several times a week, and they would want to eat, and they would want to drink, and they would sing, and they would conduct chariot races. They would push each other around in chairs to see who could win the race, right? And then after they'd had enough to drink, another thing she remembered is they'd start grabbing at her, right? She'd have to get out of there, right? But that's a much different picture than this idea of decompressing to poetry, right? So this is where we see how the rhetoric of the leadership talking about remaining decent Germans as part of these killing groups is transformed, in fact, into what happens actually on the ground, and the way the men themselves participate in these acts is much different. Yes.
This is not a usual Holocaust study or presentation. I think I'm not too far off when I say it's unusual. What led you to study this phenomenon?
Yeah, so the way I came to this topic, actually, when we talk to our students, a lot of times when they say they want to write about something, I talk about lived experience, right? How our own lived experience can inform the way we see things around us. And in terms of some of these, like I said, as a pilot in a combat arm when it was a male-only flying community, fraternity, if you will, there were manifestations, not this extreme manifestation, but there's manifestations of this kind of camaraderie, misogyny that gets linked into that as well. And what came to me as I was teaching my students and using various books, Wendy Lauer's books on Hitler's Fury, as I talked about, Father Dubois, Holocaust by Bullets, and Chris Browning's Ordinary Men, was how alcohol was being discussed in various ways by the perpetrators and how it was being used. And then I thought about some of my own experience in the military and the way in which camaraderie, which can be a very positive thing, and drinking and building camaraderie can be a very positive thing, but how it also has that flip side that can be a negative thing, and we see that. So it became, for me, part of just digging into that topic and thinking about how the flip side of the use of that alcohol was incorporated in the perpetrators. And what was really important, since I'd already looked at the effect of organizational culture, how leadership within the police socialized and created expectations of policemen during the Third Reich, but also this gives you an idea of how perpetrators, their behaviors, what the behaviors tell you about what they're thinking. And, I'm not a psychologist, and I can't open up their mind and see what they're thinking. But when I see these behaviors and when I see what the witnesses, how they describe the actions of the perpetrators especially, that gives me insight into that perpetrator mindset that I otherwise wouldn't have.
Can I ask what happened afterwards? You go from free-flowing tax laws, alcohol, what happens when you go back home and have to live with what you've done?
Well, that's another really good question, because I think there's two answers to that. So, first, again, some people say, "Oh, yeah, so there are a bunch of alcoholics," and I kind of want to push back against that. How many people here have seen the show Mad Men? Right? Anybody? Fifth Avenue. Okay. They come in to work in New York in the morning, and at the first meeting in the morning, what's Don Draper and the guys? What are they doing? They're drinking. They're drinking a highball, right? They go to lunch. They have martinis. They go into the afternoon meeting, and they're drinking again. And they go home, and they're drinking again. And from today's standard, we go, they're a bunch of alcoholics. Well, they may have alcohol use disorder, as the DSM tells us. But the idea is that's a socially constructed. That's the way you drink, right? And what we sometimes forget is that drinking is socially constructed, just like masculinity, so expectations of drinking. Now, to get back, Melissa, to your question, these men who have been involved in this, the dissertation, I think, that needs to be written, actually, ties to how did they reintegrate into German society. Many of the men who were policemen, stayed with the police, as you might expect after the war. They became involved with the police again. They became police officers. They spent a career there. How did they interact with their families and their wives? And the thing that is most surprising to me, almost no policeman would go to the federal prosecutor after the war and say, 10 years, 15 years, hey, I've got to get something off my chest. This is what we did during the war. Where those investigations would start, though, an abused spouse, domestic violence in the house. And the wife would go to the police, and she would complain about her husband. And then over the course of the discussion with the policeman, she said, oh, and by the way, let me tell you what his buddies and he talk about when they get together and drink. And that's how a number of these investigations into police units started after the war. So my feeling is that men who had this perception of masculinity, who lived that kind of ideal, it doesn't turn off in 1945. It continues after the war. And I know we have police representatives here, and it's no surprise that if you look at studies, because of the nature of the job, alcohol and drinking are an issue. Just like in the military, alcohol and drinking are often an issue, right? So we see some manifestations of those same types of pressures and the same types of alcohol use in that case as well. But I really do believe if you dug down into this, and if the records are out there, we'll see these men display the same types of behaviors that they did during the war. Yes.
Sort of similar to the questions that was asked earlier about the juxtaposition of the one image versus the other image. The fact that they not only documented and celebrated the amount of murders that they had committed, how do you relate that to, well, of course we know the Nazis documented everything, but in the war they were destroying those documents to cover up the evidence. So how do you juxtapose that between people getting around in social circles, getting drunk and saying, oh, we did this and that?
Yeah, the good thing being a German historian is they destroyed a lot of documents, but they had a lot of documents to destroy, right? So the documents that we have that were microfilmed, that were taken, we really have a lot of evidence. And one of the things, for example, I'll mention Father Dubois again, by going into Ukraine and now in the Baltics and Poland and talking to witnesses, non-Jewish witnesses who were in those communities, right? We see how that information was still available to us to get to this, to describe these kinds of actions. So there's actually quite a lot of documentation. In some cases, again, policemen themselves, when they were investigated, you have individuals who would come clean and say, yeah, this is what we did. This is what I thought at the time. But it normally wasn't them coming forward to do it. It was after the fact. Now, the other thing that I would point out is we look at what happened in Rwanda. We see a number, and I saw a number of parallels that would take place here. And a friend of mine who was a child survivor of the genocide in Rwanda, she talks about, for example, how the neighbors took their stuff. She saw a neighbor wearing her mother's dress. The perpetrators would gather in the cabarets. These are those local bars. They would barbecue the livestock of the victims. They would drink. They would plan for the next day. They would celebrate and essentially distribute the spoils from that day. So what we see is this is not just about Nazi Germany, right? These are behaviors that we see in other places and other times. The Balkans, for example, alcohol and sexual violence, alcohol and killing are definitely tied into this discussion as well. So I think that the idea of the way in which it's used, again, gives us insights not only into the Holocaust per se, but also allows us to ask questions in other ways as well. And again, college campuses don't have to worry about what I'm talking about here, but there's issues. There's issues that stem from some of these very same things. And I think that makes my students sometimes very uncomfortable, because when I talk about this, there's a little bit of that sometimes that maybe it doesn't look as good to them as they thought it might have before we had this discussion. I'm sorry for a very dark, I know the Holocaust, you knew it was going to be bad, you just didn't know it was going to be this bad, right? So, but I thank you all for your attention and your questions.
Well, I thank you. Yes, just we are honored to have you speak for us today, and such fascinating and yes, disturbing insights into the way that alcohol and played into the psychology of this genocide and others as well. Thank you again. And so I think we're going to take a short break now, a 15-minute break. And thank you very much.